The sun bathed Disneyland in a golden afternoon glow, the summer heat softened by the laughter of children and the cheerful music floating from every corner. Families wandered through the park, wide-eyed and joyful, snapping photos and lining up for rides. Among them was the Miller family, David and Karen, and their two daughters, 10-year-old Sarah and 7-year-old Emily. It was their first trip to the Magic Kingdom, a long-awaited vacation meant to bring them closer together. Emily, small for her age and bursting with energy, clutched her stuffed bunny, ears frayed from years of love. Her wide eyes sparkled as she begged to go into the haunted mansion. Sarah rolled her eyes but agreed. As they entered the line, David noticed Emily wandering a few steps away, drawn toward a nearby vendor selling glowing balloons. "Stay close, sweetheart," he called. She nodded but didn't return. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. Karen turned to look. Emily was gone. Panic started slow, a quick scan of the immediate area, a call of her name. But soon, it became frantic. They split up, retraced steps, questioned strangers. The staff was alerted, security mobilized. Loudspeakers made announcements. Radios crackled with descriptions: female, age 7, brown hair, pink dress, white sandals, carrying a gray stuffed bunny. Hours passed. The sun set, casting long shadows over Tomorrowland. Police arrived, combing through every ride, employee area, and restroom. "A child doesn't just disappear," they said. But Emily had. Her stuffed bunny was found near a bench outside the haunted mansion, clean, undamaged, deliberately placed. That detail chilled everyone. By midnight, the park was sealed. Cameras reviewed. Witnesses questioned. No one saw anything. It was as if she had stepped off the path of reality and vanished into the storybook shadows of the park. Her parents never left that night the same. Disneyland would never again feel like the happiest place on earth. The days following Emily's disappearance felt like a nightmare the Millers couldn't wake up from. Their home, once filled with cheerful chaos and the hum of ordinary life, fell silent. Toys lay untouched. Emily's favorite cartoon still played at 4 p.m., but no one turned on the TV. Her room remained exactly as it had been, the bed still unmade from that morning, her tiny shoes lined neatly at the door. Karen sat in there often, clutching one of Emily's sweatshirts, breathing in the faint scent of her daughter that was already beginning to fade. David buried himself in coordination with the police. Every day he drove to the Anaheim station, hoping for a new lead, a tip, anything. Detectives were kind, but their eyes told the truth, they were baffled. No one had seen Emily leave the area. None of the security footage showed anything useful. The theory of her simply walking away didn't sit right with anyone. She had been happy, excited. She wasn't a child known to wander far, especially without telling someone. News vans began lining up outside the house. Reporters knocked daily, some respectful, others invasive. Headlines called Emily the vanishing girl of Disneyland. Karen and David sat before cameras, their voices trembling as they pleaded with the public. "Please, if you've seen anything, if you know anything, no matter how small, help us bring our daughter home." Tips flooded in, but each one collapsed under scrutiny. A woman in Nevada claimed she saw a girl resembling Emily at a truck stop. It wasn't her. A man insisted he saw a Disneyland worker escorting a crying child to a side gate, but the timeline didn't match. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the world moved on. But not the Millers. Sarah, Emily's older sister, struggled in silence. She stopped talking at school. At night, she'd lie awake listening to her parents weep in the next room, guilt gnawing at her because she hadn't held her sister's hand tighter. One afternoon, she admitted to her parents that she saw a man watching them near the haunted mansion, tall, wearing something like a uniform. But she hadn't thought anything of it at the time. The police reopened the angle, combing through the park's employee records. One worker, a janitor, had clocked out early that day. His file showed inconsistencies, and his address on record was no longer valid. They pursued him, but he seemed to vanish, too. Eventually, with no solid evidence, the case grew cold. Files were boxed, labeled, and stored away. Emily became a name in a binder, a photograph on a dusty corkboard. But for her family, she was never just a case. She was a missing piece of their hearts. The storm came without much warning. In early March of 1990, a rare, torrential downpour swept across Southern California, soaking fields, flooding streets, and turning quiet creeks into angry rivers. In a rural patch of land about 20 miles southeast of Disneyland, the rain was relentless. Tom Jenkins, a middle-aged farmer who had worked the land his entire life, watched as the river bordering his orchard swelled past its banks, swallowing the lower rows of his trees. He spent the night in his truck on the high ground, flashlight in hand, hoping the flood wouldn't wash away what little the drought hadn't already taken. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, muddy silence. Branches, trash, and bits of fencing lay scattered across his property. The ground was soft and torn in places, revealing things long buried. As Tom walked through the wreckage, he spotted something unusual near the base of a gnarled oak, an exposed patch of rusted metal, circular, about 4 feet wide, surrounded by disturbed earth. It was set deep into the ground, like a hatch. At first, he assumed it was debris from a shed or old irrigation equipment pulled loose by the flood. But as he wiped away the mud and leaves, he noticed something strange. It had a heavy lock mechanism, now broken from age or pressure, and faint markings around the edge, almost like a seal. Curiosity overtook caution. He fetched his crowbar and managed to pry the hatch open. A stale gust of air hissed out from below, damp and sour, smelling faintly of mildew and something older, like a room that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Shining his flashlight down, he saw a narrow wooden ladder leading into a dark cavity beneath the earth. Against his better judgment, he descended slowly, boots creaking against rotted rungs. The space beneath was a small room, maybe 10 feet square, with walls made of concrete and dirt reinforced by old wood beams. The flashlight beam caught something along one wall, faded children's drawings, smeared with age, crudely done in crayon or pencil. Stars, animals, a castle. In the corner sat a rusted metal bed frame, with the remains of a rotted mattress and tangled, yellowed bedding. Next to it, a cracked mirror, a plastic comb, and scattered toys, decades old, coated in grime, but unmistakably from the 1970s. A small, gray stuffed bunny lay partially buried in the dirt, its button eyes staring blankly at nothing. Tom stumbled back, heart pounding. Whatever this place was, it wasn't a storm shelter or a root cellar. It was something else. Something wrong. He climbed out as fast as he could and called the sheriff. By nightfall, police tape cordoned off the area, and crime scene lights turned the muddy orchard into a scene from a horror story. No one said the words yet, but everyone knew, this was not a forgotten shelter. It was a prison, and someone, likely a child, had lived here. Deputies and forensic specialists arrived at the orchard before dawn, their headlights cutting through the thick mist still clinging to the soaked earth. The strange underground chamber had already stirred whispers among the small team. Some had grown up hearing stories about the girl who vanished from Disneyland in 1970. Most had dismissed it as urban legend, but now, confronted with the chilling evidence buried beneath the farmland, the old mystery felt terrifyingly real again. The hatch creaked as they opened it a second time, this time more carefully. Floodwaters had softened the surrounding soil, making the structure unstable. A ladder was lowered to replace the decayed original, and crime scene lights were threaded down the narrow shaft. What they found below didn't resemble anything official. There were no signs of utility connections, no ventilation, no insulation. This wasn't a fallout shelter or forgotten storage room. It was a secret. The concrete walls were uneven, poured hastily and reinforced with rotting wooden planks. The air was stale and musty, filled with the scent of mold, old fabric, and something else, decay. On the far side of the room, the walls were covered with drawings, dozens of them, layered over each other. Some were cheerful, a sun with rays, stick figures of a smiling girl and what might have been a family. Others were more disturbing, dark scribbles, faces with no mouths, heavy black crayon strokes scratching out once bright images. There was a calendar drawn in pencil directly onto the wall, tallied like a prisoner's markings, hundreds of slashes, organized into rows and groups, the last few trailing off abruptly. Near the bed was a pile of rusted tin cans, empty food containers, and crumpled candy wrappers from brands no longer in production. A small tape player lay half buried in the dirt, its plastic casing yellowed with age. Forensics collected it along with several other personal items, including a child-sized sweater, now reduced to little more than threads and dust. But it was the stuffed bunny that stopped everyone cold. Though filthy and weathered, it was recognizable. Photographs from the original missing persons file had shown it clutched in the girl's hand during her last known moments. The bunny had a frayed left ear and a small patch sewn onto its belly by her mother. The match was unmistakable. One of the detectives stepped aside and called into the station. Within an hour, the case file for Emily Miller was reopened, and her parents, now living quietly in Northern California, were contacted. DNA samples were ordered. The room, meanwhile, was cordoned off completely. Nothing was touched without documentation. The crime scene team worked in total silence. The deeper they dug, the more the place gave off an unbearable sense of grief. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a child's world, built in fear, shaped by isolation. A silent monument to years that should never have existed underground. And in the corner, next to the makeshift bed, beneath a pile of dirt, something metallic caught the light. An old lunchbox. Inside it, a handful of cassette tapes, hand-labeled in a shaky, childlike scrawl. Most were damaged, but a few were still intact. No one knew what they contained yet, but the mere fact that they existed changed everything. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to leave a message. At the county forensics lab, silence hung heavy as technicians began the painstaking process of cataloging the items recovered from the underground room. The stuffed bunny was sealed in a preservation bag and sent for DNA and fiber analysis. The cracked plastic comb, a faded sweater, and several strands of hair collected from the mattress and bedding were tested meticulously. The condition of the items told a grim story. Time and neglect had eaten away at nearly everything, but fragments of truth remained trapped in the decay. Within days, the first results came back. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the hair-matched samples provided by Karen and David Miller. It was her, Emily. After 20 years, the missing girl from Disneyland had finally been found, though not in any way her family had prayed for. The sheriff's department held a closed-door briefing to share the discovery. No cameras, no press, just investigators and a family who had been stuck in a nightmare for 2 decades. Karen collapsed into tears as she clutched the photo of the bunny, the same one Emily had named Mr. Buttons. David stared in silence, hands clenched into fists, his expression frozen between disbelief and rage. Sarah, now an adult, sat beside them, face pale, eyes empty. A part of their lives that had been in suspended animation for 20 years had suddenly snapped back into brutal focus. The hope they had carried for decades was extinguished in a moment of cold scientific certainty. Investigators immediately began reevaluating the original suspect list, focusing on employees who worked at Disneyland in the summer of 1970. One name stood out: Charles Dwyer. At the time, he had been a maintenance worker assigned to various zones in the park, including the area surrounding the haunted mansion. His file had shown inconsistencies during the initial investigation. He had called out sick the day after Emily disappeared and had left his position abruptly 2 weeks later. When police attempted to locate him back then, the address listed was an abandoned trailer. New searches unearthed a more complete profile. Dwyer had no immediate family, lived under multiple aliases in the years since, and had purchased a small parcel of land, ironically, under a shell company. That land, it turned out, was now part of the Jenkins orchard. The very soil where the hatch had been discovered. What truly turned suspicion into confirmation, however, was a photo uncovered in an old Disneyland employee yearbook. In it, Dwyer stood in uniform, tall, thin, unsmiling. On his belt was a ring of keys, and his ID badge marked him as having unrestricted access to utility areas and maintenance corridors. When shown the photo, Sarah Miller, haunted by her own memory from that day, quietly nodded. "That's the man who was watching us," she said. But the most chilling discovery came from the lunchbox. Of the 5 tapes inside, 2 were still playable. Forensic audio technicians cleaned up the static and distortion, finally revealing a young girl's voice, timid, uncertain. It was Emily. "If anyone finds this, I don't know what day it is anymore. I miss my mommy. I try to be good. He says I can go home soon, but I don't believe him." Her words faltered, then came the soft hum of a lullaby, sung quietly to herself. The room fell silent when the tape ended. There were no dry eyes, no words. Only the crushing realization that this child had never stopped hoping to be found. And now, finally, she was, but not in the way she deserved. The search for Charles Dwyer intensified as law enforcement traced his movements through old property records, DMV filings, and Social Security data. Years of living off the grid had left a faint trail, but not an invisible one. Eventually, they found him, living under the name Carl DeWitt in a quiet retirement community near Barstow. He was 73 now, frail, walking with a cane, and known to neighbors as a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. He tended to his small garden, volunteered occasionally at a thrift store, and attended church on Sundays. No one suspected the quiet old man of hiding a monstrous past. Authorities didn't approach him with fanfare. They arrived in unmarked cars, knocking at his door just after sunrise. He answered in a worn flannel shirt and slippers, blinking at the men on his porch. When asked to come in for questioning, he didn't resist, just sighed quietly, as if he had been expecting the moment for a long time. "Let me get my coat," he said simply. At the station, Dwyer sat in a bare interrogation room across from two detectives, his face lined with age, but his eyes alert. They showed him photos of the bunker, the stuffed bunny, and finally, of young Emily Miller. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he whispered. What followed was a halting, fractured confession. He had seen Emily at the park that day, near the haunted mansion, drifting slightly away from her family. Something in him snapped. He said it had been like watching a movie, unreal, dreamlike. He lured her away, using a balloon and a story about a secret ride. He knew the park's maintenance tunnels and back entrances better than most. Within minutes, they were out of public view. Dwyer had already prepared the bunker months earlier on a piece of remote land he had inherited from a cousin. In his twisted mind, it was a place to protect her away from the world. "I wanted her to stay little forever," he said, as if that explained anything. He described how he brought her food, toys, and even recorded her voice on tapes when she felt alone. But over time, Emily became sick. She cried constantly. She begged to go home. And when she finally stopped speaking, he said he didn't know what to do. "She just stopped," he mumbled. Then she didn't wake up one day. He buried her there, under the mattress, and sealed the room as best he could. For years, he told himself no one would find it. He avoided the land, sold it off under false names, and slipped into a new life like a snake shedding its skin. He was never questioned again. Until now. Detectives recorded every word. When asked why he had taken Emily, why he had stolen a child from her family and imprisoned her underground, his answer chilled the room: "Because I could." The case moved quickly after that. Dwyer was formally charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder, among other crimes. The evidence, the tapes, DNA, personal items, and now his own confession, was overwhelming. In custody, he seemed eerily calm, even relieved. As if he had carried a weight for so long that finally being seen for what he was had become a kind of release. News of the arrest made national headlines. The story of the girl who vanished in Disneyland had an ending now, dark and incomprehensible, but an ending nonetheless. And for the first time in 20 years, the name Emily Miller was spoken not with mystery, but with truth. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the day Charles Dwyer stood trial. The case had drawn massive media attention, not just because of its tragic details, but because of the location where it had all started, Disneyland, the symbol of childhood innocence. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, but sketch artists captured the grim expressions of the jury, the stoic faces of detectives, and the haunted eyes of the Miller family as they sat in the front row, confronting the man who had stolen their daughter and their peace for 2 decades. Dwyer, dressed in a beige prison jumpsuit and seated in a wheelchair, seemed frail but detached. He rarely looked up, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Only once, when the prosecutor described the contents of the underground room, did his eyes flicker, briefly, like a shadow passing over glass. The prosecution built their case with clinical precision. Photos of the bunker were shown to the jury, the crude concrete walls, the scattered toys, the rusted bed frame. Then came the physical evidence, the stuffed bunny, Emily's hair fibers, the DNA matches, and finally, the cassette tapes. The room went still as the court played a short, restored clip from one of the tapes. Emily's small voice crackled through the speakers. "I had a dream about Mommy and Sarah. We were eating cake. I think it was my birthday. I miss them a lot." The sound of her voice, fragile, distant, full of desperate hope, brought tears to nearly every face in the room. Karen covered her mouth, trembling. David stared ahead, unmoving, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The defense had little to offer. They claimed diminished capacity, citing Dwyer's age and supposed mental illness. They brought in psychologists who argued that he had been disconnected from reality, unable to understand the consequences of his actions. But the prosecution countered with chilling clarity: Dwyer had maintained jobs, false identities, and property records. He had calculated his actions, planned the abduction, and sustained the deception for decades. That wasn't mental illness, it was evil, deliberate, and premeditated. Sarah testified too. Now a mother herself, she took the stand and described the moment she'd seen Dwyer watching them in the park. "I thought he was just a worker," she said. "He didn't look scary. That's what haunts me. He looked normal." Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "I was supposed to protect my little sister." After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and media frenzies, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge, with visible emotion, sentenced Dwyer to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "You took a child from the world and buried her in darkness," he said. "And for that, the world must now bury you behind bars." The courtroom exhaled. Karen and David wept quietly, holding each other for the first time with something that resembled closure. It wasn't justice in the purest sense. Nothing could bring Emily back, but it was accountability. The ghost that had followed them for 20 years had a name now, and that name would never again be free to harm anyone else. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with clouds, as though even the heavens mourned. Reporters swarmed for statements, but the Millers offered none. They walked silently to their car, carrying with them not just the grief of what had happened, but the enduring strength it took to see it through. Inside, Dwyer was escorted back to his cell. Alone. Just like the child he had kept in the dark, he now faced the quiet with only his thoughts, and no escape. Months passed after the trial, and the world began to move on. The headlines faded, the cameras disappeared, and the courtroom sketches yellowed in desk drawers. But for the Miller family, time did not march forward so easily. Grief had been their companion for 20 years, but now it had changed, no longer rooted in mystery, no longer wrapped in the desperate hope that Emily might be found. Now it was a sharp, permanent ache defined by truth, by knowing how her story ended, by imagining the lonely years she spent underground waiting to be saved. Karen Miller kept the stuffed bunny in a shadow box in her living room. It had been cleaned by the lab, but the stains couldn't be fully removed, nor should they have been. She didn't want it to look new. She wanted it to look real. Like Emily's love had touched it, held it through long, fearful nights. A silent witness to the years that had been stolen. David returned to work slowly, burying himself in projects to keep the quiet at bay, but he often found himself standing still, lost in memory, trying to picture Emily's voice not as a recording, but as it had once been, alive, calling out, "Daddy," across the kitchen floor. Sarah became an advocate. She began speaking at events focused on missing children, using her family's story to raise awareness about the long-term impact of abductions. "We didn't get a miracle," she said at one gathering, her voice calm but steely, "but we got an answer. And that matters." Her words resonated with other families still searching, still praying. She carried Emily with her in every speech, every photo, every hand she held after the microphone turned off. Then came a letter. It arrived one rainy afternoon in a plain envelope, addressed to Karen and David. There was no return address, just a postmark from upstate California. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. No signature. She used to sing when she was alone. "I didn't always listen, but sometimes I did." She sang about her mom, and about stars. "I don't remember all the words. I know what I did can never be undone. But I wanted you to know, she never forgot you. Not once." The Millers turned it over, searched for fingerprints, any clue to its sender. It was likely from Dwyer, mailed through a third party or slipped past the system. Or maybe it was a cruel prank by someone who'd read too much. They sent it to authorities, who opened an investigation, but no answers came. The mystery remained. But for Karen, it didn't feel like cruelty. It felt like a final, strange fragment of truth. A confirmation that even in captivity, Emily had carried love with her. That spring, the family held a memorial in a small park outside Anaheim. No media. No spectacle. Just a simple gathering under a tree Emily had loved as a child. They placed a plaque at the base, in loving memory of Emily Rose Miller, 1965–1970. The light you carried shines still. Friends and strangers came. Some brought flowers, some brought candles. Others brought their own missing person posters, faces of sons and daughters lost to time, drawn by the quiet hope that maybe, somehow, they too would find an answer someday. As the sun set behind the trees, Sarah stood beside the plaque and read a few of Emily's own words from the tapes. Maybe the stars will tell you where I am. The crowd stood in silence, eyes lifted to the sky as the first stars blinked into view. And for the first time in a long, long while, the Millers didn't feel entirely alone. Emily's story had ended in darkness, but her memory lived now in light, a constellation of truth shining in the hearts of everyone who remembered.